Hello? Maybe you could pull down the...
Good afternoon and welcome to Dateline New Haven on WNHH-FM, New Haven's home for community radio. I'm Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make New Haven tick. We got someone who's been making New Haven tick longer than most people around, State Senator Martin Looney, who is the state senator from the 11th District in New Haven. He is the President Pro Tem. I think today I'm going to ask you what Pro Tem means. Right. President Pro Tem of the State Senate, and he's running again for re-election this year. Martin Looney was also the first person who ever appeared on WNHH-FM when we started in 2015, and it's always a pleasure to have you back. Hi, Marty. Thanks for coming on.
Hi, Paul. Great to be with you today.
What is Pro Tem?
Well, it's a term means Pro Tem means temporary, but in this case that doesn't really apply. But in many cases where you have a case where or technically the lieutenant governor is actually the presiding officer of the Senate, but doesn't have any appointed powers or anything within the Senate. But then the President Pro Tem, meaning temporary, is the actual president of the Senate.
Is this an archaic leftover from colonial times or something?
It is pretty old. Yeah, it's a pretty old tradition.
Like, right? Why can't we just call you the president? Oh, because the state lieutenant governor, like the vice president, presides over the Senate.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. Yep. Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay. Well, learn something new today.
There's also like differently, like in the House of Representatives, it's always ironic is that the leader of the House is the Speaker, but the Speaker almost never actually speaks on bills. Whereas in the Senate, the President usually gives the summation speech at the end on a major bill anyway. Yeah.
So how do you think Speaker, is that again another kind of archaic form?
I think so, yes.
Or was it was the role mostly speaking when it started?
Yeah, I think it's, but for some reason, it's true. I think in Washington and in most states, it is the majority leader in the House who gives the summation speeches in floor debate. And the Speaker, it's a very rare occasion when the Speaker will come off the podium and actually speak on a bill.
That's so interesting. Well, I'm going to ask you to speak, Martin Looney. I'm going to speak about three things today. I want to talk to you about the session that just ended in Hartford. Even though it's what they call a short session where you're 1 month less than other years and you don't do the main 2-year budget, a lot got done. I want to ask you about that. I want to ask you about your running for re-election, what issues you're looking at. And then I want to ask you overall some of the state and federal elections coming up because we have election season for that too.
Sure.
But let's start with the session. We talked before we went on the air that one of the big foci of the session was children's health and children's education. That because of the pandemic, there seemed to be an extra push for dealing with mental health concerns for children as well as catching up with schools because of time lost in in-person learning during the pandemic. Is that accurate?
That's accurate.
So what happened?
We were concerned that because of the pandemic, there was so much effective time lost in schools. In many districts, students didn't do well with online learning. There was concern about increased stress at home. We saw a spike in mental health concerns for young people. And we felt we really needed to address that this year because we had more resources than we've had in prior years. So that was a major focus. Senate Bill 1 and Senate Bill 2 and House Bill 5001 all dealt with that. And
when you number Senate bills, isn't that your way that you're signaling, Marty?
It's a way that we're signaling
this is our top priority.
Major caucus priority, that's right. So, but that was the thing that we were concerned both about resources. We wanted to make sure there were more resources for children in schools. We know there's a real shortage of mental health counseling for students, especially those who need more than what's provided in the schools. Many parents can't get counseling for their kids outside of school. Many providers don't take insurance. So we're putting more money into that system, more money into the schools. But also we were concerned about the very early stages of child development. We know that many students do poorly in school because when they come to kindergarten, they're not ready for kindergarten. They're really behind developmentally. And school becomes a place where they become aware of their shortcomings, and they turn off after a while. And those are the kids who start to become chronically truant when they're about 10 years old and are in trouble with the juvenile system by the time they're 12 or 13. So we want to make sure that...
So is this a pre-K thing?
Right, pre-K. We put a lot more money into pre-K, into daycare, into birth to 3 services, care for kids, things of that nature that were a high priority for us, and we want to make sure that kids get an intervention early on so that they have a fighting chance when they get to school. My daughter-in-law taught at intercity schools, and she said it was heartbreaking to see sometimes the very limited vocabulary that kids had when they came to school. Some had never been even read to, and really no experience with books at all. It was just you wonder how can they possibly make up for that time, and that's been one of the challenges.
Well, biggest that's emerged here in New Haven is resistance to a law you folks passed called the right to read. As you know, nationally, when you and I were younger, Marty, there was this movement toward whole language learning. You know, some kids learn by looking at a picture, guessing what the word is, or looking at the word and guessing what it might be when you don't sound it out. And the people, Lucy Calkins is the most famous example, designed the curriculum based on that for 50 years, have reassessed based on brain science studies the last 20 years, saying the kids actually need the heavy focus on phonics, and that the people we thought might need the variations most, who were behind the achievement gap, actually need a return to that focus. So you guys passed a bill saying that you have to have curriculum starting next year, not upcoming year after, for that early age, really K to 3, to teach them in what's called structured literacy with a more phonics focus. New Haven is resisting. They're saying, the people who are saying this are in charge kind of are our generation, and they're saying, we like the way we did it. We think that makes more sense. Went on into this new fad. There's kind of a showdown. Gary Winfield went there, he's state senator, and told the city, you're really going to have to get in line with this. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because that's really left the kids behind.
The city should absolutely get in line with this. I think it's appalling that what the reading levels are in the New Haven public schools. You can defend a system if it's working, but it is not working. I think what was the recent study, I think, showed that only, I think it's 28% of kids in New Haven are reading at grade level.
Third graders, yeah.
In third grade? Well, that's failure. So you
and
need
in
to
one
do something
measure, it
else.
was 87 were below in one measure.
Yes.
And then in math, it was even worse.
Right. How can you defend that when the results are so appalling?
I guess what they're saying is that this is the latest fad, but kids need different kind of approaches because not every kid learns with one size all. The response to the other is that's a very small percentage of kids you can get that help, and that the other stuff you're talking about, like making reading fun or, you know, having positive attitude towards books, can be part of that curriculum. But what the shift is to have a much bigger focus on sounding out. They actually said it hurt the kids when you tried. We didn't think it used to. That if you're saying guess what the word is based on what it looks like, or based on a picture in a book what word that is, they thought that actually hurt the kids' ability to read.
Well, the primary responsibility for education is at the state level. Mm-hmm. The state delegates authority to the municipal level, but the municipalities are supposed to carry out state policy.
So what can you do as a state senator? You passed the law. New Haven's dragging its feet about it, complying. Is there any role for you at this point, or is that now up to the State Board of Education to say yes or no?
Well, I think it's primarily up to the State Board, but obviously Senator Winfield and I are concerned about it. I believe other members of the delegation are. So I think there are ways that we can apply pressure as well.
And I'm also wondering the time that's going to be lost. Like if ultimately the state has to say yes or no to a waiver, that's going to be another year. So they've just gotten a whole bunch of new books in that teach the old way. And if they're fighting, I'm just wondering how we're going to get out of this right now in New Haven with the overwhelming majority of our kids not learning to read, and this fight over whether we're going to go with what the science is telling us is better, although that's always a tricky sentence. I don't know. Any thoughts about how we can get past this impasse?
Well, I think part of it is the legislation we passed that we need to make sure that kids are prepared for kindergarten when they get there so they're ready to read. Kids who come from homes where there's more educational enrichment, many of them are already at least beginning to read by the time they get to kindergarten. And so they've already jumped over several of those hurdles that too many kids in New Haven are still struggling with in third, fourth grade and beyond. So I think the focus on early childhood will be an assistance in that.
Right. And, it was interesting that the student member of the Board of Ed said at that Board of Ed meeting that a lot of his colleagues in high school can't sound out basic words when they read.
Yes.
That's sad, Marty.
It is terribly sad, right? We need to be doing something better for those kids and not just let an educational bureaucracy say, oh, we got to do this because that's what we've been doing recently.
Yeah, and Marty, mental health also has been so sad. It's not just in schools. We see in schools because that's where the rubber hits the road often in public discussion about civic issues. But, you've heard from all the teachers, from the kids, about everyone bouncing off the walls from the problems that existed before but got so much worse in COVID, how to act in schools. So you said you passed a bill that's going to have many more mental health counselors available in the classroom. And after you passed that bill, didn't the federal government also, in the gun bill, the Chris Murphy, the bipartisan gun bill, didn't that also include money for mental health services in
Yes,
schools?
I believe that does. There'll be some extra money in that. If I can just run down some of the spending that we did put in the bill, some specifics. There's $10 million in new money for mental health services at school-based health centers, and $30 million for increased 24/7 mobile crisis services for kids. And
So $30 million for that?
$30 million, and then also $70 million for childcare industry wage enhancements, because we know that so many people who work in the childcare field are so
Remember
badly
they
compensated.
had that walkout, quote unquote, one
Yes.
morning in New Haven. Georgia Goldblum and her coalition. They have a good coalition in New Haven.
Yes.
You know better than I do. Of providers who said without that money they were going out of business.
Absolutely. Many of them were just they're operating on a shoestring, and that shoestring is frayed. And we have $15 million to renovate and construct new early childhood facilities, and
Okay.
so there's a lot in there. And then we're looking at the school situation too. Again, in the wake of COVID, everybody's much more aware of dangers. We put $75 million to update school air conditioning and heating systems.
Oh, we need that in New Haven.
Well, we need that in New Haven in many ways
Yeah.
because of inadequate maintenance. We spent so much money over the years building new schools in New Haven and renovating other schools. It was about a $1.5 billion project, of which the state contributed about $1.2 billion. And here we hear shortly afterwards that in many cases that heating and cooling systems are needing significant repairs, in some cases only because they never changed the filters regularly. And all of a sudden have to have massive repairs where just regular maintenance would have deferred all of that. I mean, that's just outrageous. So we are going to mandate the Board of Ed make schools more accountable and make sure they document what their regular maintenance schedule is on their equipment, since we've given them so much money on this. Also, there's $8 million also for increasing access to town-run summer camps for kids as well. So there's new funding on all fronts, both for
So you were able to put a lot of money toward kids.
yes.
And one of your colleagues said to me, we've been up there for years when we always said there's not enough money to go around. There was this money that flowed in for pandemic relief, money that flowed in through higher than expected revenues. We just read about that yesterday. Is this a one-off? Like, are we doing things that we're going to be able to do long-term? Or is a lot of this stuff, if you're constructing facilities, I guess that doesn't need to be long-term?
No, well, that's something that we hope will have
Or the
long-term
mental health
benefit after
counseling,
the one-time expenditure and things we do through. Well, some of it will be bonding, and then those bonds are paid off over a period of years. But we hope that we will be able to keep this going, because it is necessary, since we've been underfunding in many areas since the last great recession back in 2009. So we had about 12 difficult years before we finally got to the time where we could catch up in so much of this area. So, for instance, we increased the state earned income tax credit for the working poor,
Right, that was a biggie.
to 41.5%. And
Of what they get from the state?
of what they get from the federal, right. So we had instituted that program some years ago at 30%. It went down to 23%.
Well, that's sort of been your number one poverty fighting measure that I've watched you champion, in terms of you don't even have a Democratic governor who's willing to raise marginal income tax rates on the wealthy. So it sounds like people who are concerned about poverty level, getting people out of poverty, have been focusing on tax credits really since Bill Clinton's day as the way that's going to be the next best way to help people get above the
Well,
poverty
that's right. We
line.
passed the EITC at the state level back in 2011. Prior to that, both Governor Rowland and Governor Rell had said that was a deal breaker in terms of the budget. They were
Wow.
completely against it. And the reason was they could never get beyond the fact that it was a refundable credit. They kept saying, well, these people don't pay taxes. They don't pay income taxes because they're generally below the threshold where you have tax liability. Our argument was they pay plenty of taxes. They pay sales taxes in a disproportionate amount. They pay property taxes through their rent. They pay car taxes. They pay sales taxes. They pay everything except income tax. But finally, we were able to get that passed. Governor Malloy embraced it. We passed it in 2011. It wound up getting scaled back a little bit in 2017 when we had to deal with the Republicans to pass a budget. It went down to 23. We got it back to 30.5 and now to 41.5 in this budget. So I know Speaker Ritter and I are committed to try to keep it at that high level going forward. Also, the child tax credit that we passed this year, we're committed to try to make that a permanent feature as well at $250.
And they did a good job in the
per
last
kid.
week getting
Yes.
those numbers up by
Yes.
like another 100,000 of people, because they actually got to file them.
Yes.
They got to file to get
We
that
have to
rebate.
find a way. If we could find a way to have
Automatically
that credit
send
be
it.
automatic based upon, where anybody who, based upon just looking at the return they filed, to be able to determine eligibility from that. They claim that it doesn't necessarily always indicate how old the children are, but they think there have to be ways around that to have it go to people automatically rather than have them have to do a separate filing for it.
State Senator Martin Looney of New Haven running for re-election to which term? What number term?
Well, this would be my 16th term in the Senate. I was first elected to the Senate in '92, and then I served in the House for 12 years before that, 6 terms.
And he's the president pro tempore of the State Senate, which I learned today had to do with an old formulation about being technically temporary because the lieutenant governor technically presides over the Senate, though in practice the real job is done by the pro tempore. Right. Dan P.F. has written a question, Marty. He says, thank you for listening, Dan. Have you seen this year's health insurance premium requests up to 20%? Are you going to lead the legislature and finally pressure Lamont, if he's reelected, to pass the public option, or will you be giving it to lobbyists again? That's a little bit of a...
Well, I've never given it to lobbyists on this, but I've been for the public option from the very beginning. Unfortunately, others have been pressured by the insurance industry on this, but I continue to support the public option. I think that we're going to have a hearing on that coming up in sometime in August. There are tremendous disparities in the rates that are being asked. I think the Anthem rates were generally moderate, but the other two that were in there were just outrageous, going beyond 20%. So we really have to closely examine those. And
can you explain something to me about the health insurance industry? Because I have to admit my bias. I believe they shouldn't exist. I don't think there should be private health care. I think it exists only on a business model that gives them incentive to say no to people needing health care. Mm-hmm. But I realize that's a long discussion. We don't live in la-la land, and we have a health insurance industry. Yeah. So they have to get their rate increase approved, per Dan's question here, by state regulators.
Right.
During the pandemic, when people were using less health care, health insurance companies were making record profits because people were using their services less. They still asked for health insurance rate increases from you guys. Not as big as this year, but it's good. So it seems like when they're making less profit, they ask for increases. When they're making more, and I understand healthcare is expensive because you got to cover everybody, and healthcare costs a lot of money because we invent more stuff that keeps people living longer. But why do they ask for increases when times are good and not good for them? Like, what's the rationale?
Well, I think that's something they're going to have to answer in these hearings, because there really doesn't seem to be a clear rationale for that. I know the insurance industry, of course, is very strong and influential in Connecticut. Probably a little bit less so since we passed public financing of campaigns, and now they're barred from doing direct funding in the way they did before, either for or against candidates. But many people are cowed by the fact that they do employ a lot of people in the state of Connecticut, which to me seems to be like the same reason why West Virginia has been willing to tolerate poor air all these years, because the coal mining industry is so strong there. You know, I think
we can tolerate people not being able to afford to get sick.
Right. So I think that's
so
the trade-off. Too many people to make.
There's
too many jobs in the industry. But it seems to me that if you want to do something that benefits 3.6 million people, that's worth it, even though it may not be something that an industry that employs 25,000 people likes.
And now they employ a lot fewer than they used to, correct? When we were in the national headquarters, like what did the CVS Aetna merger mean for that corporation being a Connecticut corporation?
Yeah, I don't know what the net numbers have been. I think there was some decline, but not as drastic as what had been feared at the beginning.
All right. Martin Looney, a big issue this term that didn't get a lot of attention, but it makes a big deal, is the Clean Air Act.
Yes.
We passed the Clean Air Act, and it was environmental legislation, everything from moving our bus fleets, both at schools and the public bus fleets, although one caught on fire last week. We saw lithium battery in Hamden. Moving them electric. Roland Lamar was on the Transportation Committee, state rep, said he thought one of the biggest advantages to our air that didn't get attention was light timing, so people don't have to stop and start. It's kind of interesting. We're modernizing the traffic lights so that they make sense, so you can kind of go at a moderate speed without stopping and starting a lot. He thinks that's one of the major contributors.
Well, I think it is.
To dirty
and Roland
air.
did a great job on that bill. It was a joint effort of the Transportation Committee and the Environment Committee. So the 4 chairs of those 2 committees worked very closely on it. And there is a lot of pollution that's caused by vehicle idling because of the poor timing of lights. And I think that Representative Lamar really targeted an issue that's going to make a big difference, especially in cities. But that was one of our priorities. That was Senate Bill number 4. And it indicates that we want to shift to electric vehicles by requiring that by 2026, at least 50% of cars and light trucks purchased by the state will be alternative fueled or hybrid, and to 100% by 2030. We also, in it, make a commitment to building more charging stations around the state. And I think that we are going to see a real breakthrough in terms of electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles. When people become more comfortable with the idea of accessibility to charging and also more comfortable about range. People are worried about getting stranded, not being able to get a charge when they need it, and they're also worried about having to spend too much time getting a charge. People are so used to driving into a gas station and being on their way in 5 or 7 minutes. They're concerned about having to invest so much time to get a charge. So when the technology develops to the point where charges are quicker and there are more charging stations, in fact, it'd be great if we had a charging station at every gas station. That would be ideal. And then you'll see, I think, more people move to electric vehicles. We did in this provide enhanced incentives for people and rebates when they buy electric vehicles,
including electric bikes, which I'm still not ready to try.
Yep. And we also we raised the threshold of the cost of a vehicle that would be eligible for a rebate to encourage more of that. So that was a significant feature of the bill, along with the traffic, the matching grant program to municipalities for traffic signal upgrades that Representative Lamar talked about.
Were there any thoughts about the lithium battery that caught fire at the Hamden bus depot the other day?
Well, I think that's going to be we're going to have to examine that closely and make sure that there's not a broad-based risk in the conversion that we're talking about. But ultimately, we want to convert the state's own vehicle fleet, municipal vehicle fleets, and also school buses to be electric, and that would make a big difference because still. The greatest amount of our air pollution does come from vehicles. I think it's something like 37 to 40% overall.
Martin Looney, State Senate President Pro Tem, State Senator from New Haven and Hamden. 48% of Hamden, he informed me he represents, and half of New Haven, right, roughly east side down to downtown.
Right.
We were talking about how when it used to be gerrymandered that Westville was part of the east side district back in the day when you first had it. Marty, there was some little noticed legislation passed as well this term under your leadership in the State Senate, one of which is the captive audience bill. Do you remember we used to talk about that a lot more back in the day, like end of last century, about how management's not supposed to be able on work time in a work setting force you to go to indoctrination meetings, not to go to unions.
My counsel, Dina Berlin, went through the files and she found that I had originally introduced the captive audience bill in 2005.
I do remember you talking about this a long time ago.
That's right. Yeah. And one of the problems for years was that arguably it was in contravention of the National Labor Relations Act.
Oh.
There was concern about that. There was
free
even
speech. You're talking about First Amendment right to force your employees
and
to
listen. There was a prior opinion by then Attorney General Jepsen that it might be problematic. But we had a more recent opinion by Attorney General Tong that green-lighted it and said that it is now proper. In fact, the counsel for the NLRB issued a statement around the time we were dealing with the bill in the spring that it was changing its own guidance on captive audience legislation. And
the idea that it's not fair that if you're trying to stop a union, you have your employees where they're working, pressuring them in a work setting where the other side can't really do that.
Right. Well, the key is, Paul, is that there are still, especially in our area now, the world of modern technology and modern communications, there are an infinite number of ways to communicate with employees. They can hand out flyers at work. They can meet and greet them before coming into work, coming out of work. They can call them at home. They can text them. They can email them. They can reach them on social media. But why are they insistent on this one? And this one is the one that's the most coercive, and that's why they want it. They want to be able to herd people into a room and threaten them. My father experienced that
at
twice
Winchester.
When he was one of the people trying to help the machinist union get into Winchesters, and he told me about this when I was a kid. The first one he recalled was he was a forklift driver there, was told to get off the forklift, get into a room. A bunch of other people were crowded into a room. Two big, beefy guys shut the door, stood there with their arms folded to make sure nobody even attempted to leave.
Wow.
The first thing that they were told was that the plant would probably close in 2 years if a union got in. The second thing they were told was that unions were connected to communism and that their loyalty would be suspect.
When was this?
Mid-50s.
Oh, that's when the height of the Red Scare.
Absolutely. And they were told then that, and then especially they were told that if they were not yet naturalized citizens, and some of them weren't, they could be subject to deportation if they became seen as being friendly to a union. And then they were told that even if you were naturalized citizens, as my father was, having been born in Ireland, that could potentially even be revoked if you were associated with unions.
So what did he do?
They voted for, in the first time it failed, the union failed narrowly, but then they continued to campaign. I remember during that time, the company tried to break him. They hoped to either make him quit or kill him. They took him off the forklift and put him lifting heavy freight, for those 2 or 3 years. But he toughed it out. And when the union got in on the second time, he got his old job back and then became a union steward, for the last 10 years that he was there until he retired. But there were captive audience meetings both during the first unsuccessful campaign and the second one. So that's why that's been a crusade of mine for many years. So I'm so pleased we were able to get it across the line this year. What's that, Paul?
You looked up to your dad, huh?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And did you think of him when you were doing this legislation?
I sure did.
What were you thinking? Like, was there a moment when you thought it, when it passed or something?
Oh, when it passed, I said to myself, it took a while, Dad, but we're there.
That's a great story, Martin Looney. Another bill that didn't get a lot of attention but did pass, which is one of those ones that kind of got me outraged, was the predatory pricing of phone calls in prison. That if you're in prison, you want to talk to one of your loved ones, family want to talk to you, you got to pay a whole lot more money than the rest of us pay for a phone call, and that's because some private company had a contract with the state to just make money off this. I mean, that was kind of sick.
Yeah, that was a bad practice. The state was using the cost of those calls, making the people calling in to pay collect call rates, and they were using it to subsidize other aspects of the corrections budget. So we did pass a bill issue. We put $3.5 million in to reduce to end that practice, so that now the prisoners will be able to make more calls and not have their callers go into debt. It's really important because, as you know, most of the people who are in prison are from Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, Waterbury, New Britain, and the prisons are located at more remote places in eastern Connecticut. So
Enfield Summers, and
Montville and other places. So, and many come from poor families where their family members don't have cars, and it's not easy to go visit somebody who's in prison. In fact, we know in New Haven there are some census tracts where more than 40% of the households don't even have cars. So, but studies also show that those prisoners who are able to keep in close contact with their family while they're incarcerated do much better in reentry. When they come out, they're part of a network. They haven't lost contact. So that we think that is really just something that's part of our approach toward effective rehabilitation.
State Senator Martin Looney, we've been talking about what happened this past session in Hartford here on Dateline New Haven on WNHH-FM, New Haven's home for community radio. And we're going to pivot to what he's hoping to have happen next if he's reelected and gets to serve a 16th term, or is it 17th?
It would be 16th.
16th term in the state Senate. And here's the transition issue. One thing you and I just did not talk about for a half hour is the thing that Democrats are talking most about this past session, which I find interesting. Democrats running for election talk about how much they cut taxes, which is what you usually hear Republicans talk about, right? So Ned Lamont early on knew that when he ran re-election as governor, he was going to be attacked as someone raising taxes. So he made sure he didn't raise any taxes. And then when we got all this COVID money, he invested he included short-term tax cuts to the gas tax, the kind of things that liberals traditionally hated because they say it doesn't really save people that much money. In fact, it could have worse impacts for people when you don't have money left for other kinds of spending if you're cutting the gas tax, and it encourages driving, and it expires once an election is over. It seems like the Democrats, are they emphasizing this to take the issue away from the Republicans? Why are we hearing so much about tax cuts?
Well, I think many Democrats want to point that out, that they're not just profligate spending, want to be responsible. Some of the reductions, some of the ones you mentioned, really are beneficial to moderate income people. So, for instance, the free bus rides up until December 1st.
Bus is great.
That's important for poor people. As I said, there are so many people who just don't have cars.
Can we make that permit?
I would support doing that. We have to see. But the problem is, again, we have to balance that with the needs of our special transportation fund, which we use for all of our infrastructure purposes. But I think it's an important thing. The gas tax cut of 25 cents was important. Also, we're hearing from businesses close to the Massachusetts line that the gas stations up there are doing very well because Massachusetts hasn't cut theirs. So gas is cheaper up in the northern part of Connecticut. I would hope that the federal government would do the same thing by suspending their 18-cent gas tax, and that would help make a difference also. But that was an important one. I think also the one of the things that I've been working on for a long time was the car tax. Right. And that was something that's
a different issue. That's the unfairness that if you have the same car in a wealthy town, you pay twice as much tax.
Wildly different rates in different communities. Even though you can say the real estate is sensitive to location, but a car is the same car everywhere. So this year we were able to cap the car tax rate at a little over 32 mils. So no one will have to pay more than 32 mils. It'll benefit taxpayers in about 75 communities,
including New Haven and Hampton.
New Haven residents will benefit by about $5.8 million. And the city will be made whole by the state for that gap. And in Hamden, it's even more significant because Hamden's mill rate is higher.
Yeah.
In Hamden, it's almost a $7 million benefit to the taxpayers, and then also, but the town is being made whole.
And what I love about the tax cut debate is where you guys differ from the Republicans. Seems to me, but maybe you can help me understand it better because I'm on the outside. Seems to me a complete reversal of how Democrats and Republicans used to talk about budgets. So you guys, in addition to cutting taxes, the Democrats who control the legislature and the governors, they squirrel with this bounty, this one-time bounty. You shored up the rainy day fund to its maximum, like $1.5 billion or something, and you also pay down some of our long-term pension obligations because we haven't been funding our pensions. So basically saving billions over a course of year. And the Republicans have criticized you for conservative budgeting. They said that you should cut the taxes more now because it's a rainy day. Am I right that that's flipping what used to be the Democratic-Republican argument?
It is. So again, if you went back to the days when John Rowland was governor, we Democrats at the time, in the late 90s, we had a boom period, the dot-com boom and all that, and we had surpluses during that time. The Republicans attacked us for overtaxing. Then we said at the time that would be a good time to start putting more into the pension funds, and Rowland rejected that and instead insisted on that rebate, that $50 rebate program. So an opportunity that we really fell behind in our payments into both the Teachers Pension Fund and the State Employees Pension Fund during all of those Rowland and Rel years when they refused to do anything. To his great credit, I think Dan Malloy deserves credit for in 2011 when he came in. Even though things were tough, he insisted every year that we would make the actuarially required pension payment. Despite that, it made it much more difficult to get budgets done.
And then, Martin, what are some of the major issues, work that has not yet been completed that you want to work on if you're reelected?
Well, one that we started this year and I hope to continue next year was one of the issues that affects many municipalities is the cost of special education.
Mm-hmm.
And often that's not budgetable because you never know when a very expensive special ed case is going to move into your district and the school is responsible. The law had said that once a municipality spends 4.5 times their per pupil expenditure, then the state is supposed to pay the balance, the excess cost. But the state has only been paying 66% of that for years. So what we did this year, it put $15 million in the budget to use essentially the pilot tiered formula that we passed last year, and that the poorest towns, those with the lowest net grand list, will now get 76% instead of 66% reimbursement. The middle tier will get 73%. The third tier will get 70%. So everyone will get more than the 66 that's currently there. And that's something I would like to see increased and ratcheted up until we get closer to full funding.
Now, something you did that you've been trying to do for decades was the other kind of pilot, payments in lieu of taxes, because, and I won't go into the whole thing, but, we get much more state tax-exempt property in our cities, over half in New Haven, but we can't tax it, and we are underfunded in those reimbursements. You got us an extra $49 million this year. You kind of doubled what we got from the state every year.
Right.
Our entire adult lifetime, politicians have said the only reason taxes are so high in New Haven is because of this unfair tax situation. If the state would only give us more pilot money, we would be on the same level as other people, other towns. So you delivered. We doubled it. We got another, and you count money from Yale was over $50 million. We didn't have it before. But taxes still went up. Why was that?
Well, I guess they did come down this year. I guess they were reducing the rates at 39.75.
No, but when you went with the increase in the grand list, the average person's New Haven's taxes are going up.
Yes. Well, that's a matter of city budgeting, and I assume that they'll be coming down next year when it's a city election year. But
it's not your responsibility. I'm just wondering if we need to rethink our paradigm. We always thought the issue was Yale doesn't pay taxes. The state makes us not tax property. If they only gave us the money. So you delivered the money, finally.
Yes,
you did this new coalition of medium-sized towns and dealt them into the benefits of this plan.
Right.
And it was really smart organizing. But I guess some people say that means the city's financial situation was much more precarious and that Ned Lamont actually wanted us to go into MARB. Some people say as a condition for getting that pilot money, which we didn't do. Do you know anything about that? Or?
Yes, there was some concern at the time that that New Haven was some of the benchmarks were not being met, and that it might be a candidate for MARB. We didn't think it was that necessary. Certainly, New Haven was not in the situation that West Haven is in chronically, and believed that the city could manage itself. I think that Mayor Elliker has done a reasonable job, but I think there are certain areas of the city budget that need to be put under better control and scrutiny, like the education system. As we said, that's such a big part of the budget and needs to be more closely examined.
And Marty, another issue you talked about, you tried to pass a bill that, sometimes takes a few years to build support for a bill for medical Miranda rights, meaning if you're arrested and you're saying you're injured, you should get medical attention. Obviously, that blew up right after the session when Randy Cox was being transported in a police van, hurt his spine and neck, couldn't move, they didn't believe him, and then dragged him across the floor and might have permanently paralyzed him. Do you think that's going to enable you to pass that next term, and do you plan to reintroduce that
Yes,
bill?
I will. We did pass it in the Senate unanimously, I think, and it was not taken up in the House for whatever reason. It got caught up in the crunch of the last week. But that bill came out. I was approached by a physicians organization from Massachusetts who were connected to Brigham and Women's Hospital and a couple of other hospitals, and said there's a gap here in medical care that people sometimes are injured or ill and don't get immediate medical attention when they are arrested. So that's what I put in the bill for. And then we saw that the tragic case of Mr. Cox, because I think it's also beneficial to the police because they're not medical people. They don't know when someone complains of chest pain or headache or an injury at the time of arrest, whether it's real or serious or how much. So if they take that person to the emergency room to get a determination, all it means is that the processing of the arrest will take a little more time, but it will be safety both for the police and not being accused of medical inattention, and also safety for the person who's claiming injury.
So Martin Looney, we're talking at Dateline New Haven, WNHH New Haven's home for community radio. We've just spent a lot of time talking about laws, writing laws that bring money to the city, writing laws that make life fairer for people. Your opponent has raised a perspective that's really common to many of the races across the country this year. He's arguing that politicians who spend too much time making laws, sitting in a room with other politicians and writing legislation are out of touch with the people. And he said if he's elected, he's not going to spend time doing that. He thinks the experience of politicians in office is bad, not good. You're seeing this in other races too, that you should be out there among the people instead of being up there in rooms making laws. How do you feel about that?
Well, first of all, that's what challengers always say about incumbents. Well, he's not connected to the people, to the district, and I will be. Well, that is certainly not true in this case. I do both parts of the job. I'm in Hartford and active there and trying to be pass legislation, but I'm also involved in the community at home with community groups, with organizations.
And I guess your answer to that would be what's the vote when you run?
Yeah. So the issue is, I think that the job of being a legislator is somebody who is skilled at understanding issues and passing legislation, and also someone who keeps in touch with the constituents at home. Prior to the pandemic, I would have regular Saturday morning meetings with the state reps in my district. We'd hear from people. Since then, when it wasn't possible to do that during COVID, I've had teletown hall meetings. I'm out and around at church, the grocery store, the dry cleaners, the barbershop, talking to people on the green and everybody I meet, and going to community meetings. The last few days, I was at a meeting with the workers from Unite Here in 2017, celebrating the successful unionization of the Graduate Hotel.
That was great,
That was a great moment.
Well,
and,
in addition to that issue, Marty, which is a real issue, like you're right, they always say you're not connected enough, we don't see you, whatever.
Yes.
What about the issue about experience? Like some people say, mostly Republicans are running saying it's bad if you've been in office writing laws because you're part of the problem. Should a legislator be a legislator? Should a legislator write laws? Should a legislator gain experience in how laws get passed, and how do you get compromises with people who might not agree with you from other communities so that the money can be delivered or the laws get passed? Or does the process make you part of the problem?
No, I think you have to have experience, expertise, and skill and substantive knowledge of policy to be an effective legislator. We're seeing this now in scholarly studies of states that have adopted term limits. That in some cases, in severely term-limited states, the legislators are severely inexperienced. They know from
staff gets empowered.
Yep. What happens? The staff gets empowered, the lobbyists get empowered, and the executive branch gets empowered even more than they are now, because the legislature is not an effective counter because there's just not enough expertise there. I was speaking with a legislator from Florida at a conference I was at, and she was telling me that in Florida, the incoming freshman class picks their leaders at that time for their last term, when they will be the senior class. And the person who gets picked as leader is somebody who is from a safe district, can raise a lot of money, and can spread that around to the other people who are running in more contested races. Mm-hmm. That's not a healthy system. No. In our system, you come in, you work your way up through the committee process, you develop policy expertise, you develop the respect of your colleagues, and potentially you make progress and become a leader, chair of a committee or a caucus leader.
It's interesting to see Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan today, because her point is that the legislative branch is equal.
Yes,
and
yes.
that we can have our own foreign policy. And what do you have any thoughts on that? It's not your job. It's pretty interesting.
Well, I think Speaker Pelosi is really the best spokesperson for the legislative branch we've seen in a long time.
Yeah. And then, so in Connecticut, we have some primaries. You do not have a primary. August 9th is the primaries. New Haven has not had a statewide statewide official since Hank Parker. Is that correct? Elected official since he
That's
was
correct.
state
Since he
treasurer.
was state treasurer.
And what was his last year? Like in the 90s sometime?
No, I think it was before that. I think he was first elected in 74.
Okay.
And then I think he was there till 82.
Oh,
something
that's
like that.
all?
Yeah, yeah.
I've
So it's
been
been a long
writing an
time.
article about him in 84, I thought.
Oh.
Okay, and then Borges.
Or maybe
came.
86, but it's
So
been
it was
close to
since
40
the
years.
80s since we had.
Yeah, that's
Is
right.
that going to change? So we have two New Haveners out of 3 are running in a state treasurer primary, Eric Russell and Karen Du Bois Walton. Then Dita from Fairfield County is getting the most attention because of her ads, which may or may not have to do with the actual job, but it's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And then in the Secretary of State's race, you have Stephanie Thomas, who's from Fairfield County. So it's really Fairfield County against New Haven next week. And she's got the state endorsement, the party endorsement, so that New Haven Democrats are going door to door for her. But then Maritza Bond is challenging her. She's from New Haven, and she's running with strong labor support. How do you see those races shaping up?
Well, first of all, I think the turnout in the Democratic primary will be substantially lower than it was 4 years ago because there's no marquee race, no governor's primary, no U.S. Senate primary. Turnout in 2018, when there was a gubernatorial primary, was slightly under 30%. The Republican primary was slightly over 30% because they had an active gubernatorial primary. So I think because of their U.S. Senate primary, they'll probably have a 30% or more turnout, but I think the Democratic turnout will be under 20% this time.
And what will that mean? Who wins then? Does the party support become more important because that's a fixed number of people who work for you? Does the labor endorsement become important in Maritza Bond's case? Do private networks, Eric Russell has one kind of network of people he's built statewide through his work in the party. Karen Du Bois Walton has her own network through housing and state education and civil rights work that she's done. How's that going to play out on the ground?
What it means is that the candidates who are best able to identify the primest of the prime voters, because those are the only ones who are going to vote in this election, and contact and persuade the most of them are the ones who will win, because it's going to take a relatively small number of votes to win. So it's important to be part of a labor network or other networks that people are aware of, whether it be housing, whether it be in terms of investment capacity or investment expertise. So tapping into activist networks is going to be more important in a low turnout race.
We have the 1 through 5 number, like 1 is likely voter, 5 is definitely not going to vote, 2 is possible on your side, 3 is neutral. Is this a race where you need 1s rather than 1s and 2s? Does that affect how you do that?
Well, I think you need to look at, and I've said this to people, that you need, when your people are going out canvassing or doing phone banking, you need to look not just the 1s and 2s, but you need to look at the prior voting history of people. Are these people regular primary voters? If they are, contact them, work them hard, try to persuade them. Because if they're not regular primary voters, they're not going to vote in this primary. So it's a waste of your time and effort to spend a lot of time on them. This is, as I said, only the prime of the prime voters will participate in this.
That's so interesting. Do you want to talk about anyone you might be supporting and why?
Well, I'm supporting Karen because I've committed to her about a year ago when at the time I said, it's about time we had somebody from New Haven on the state ticket. You'd be great. And then she decided to run for treasurer. Surprisingly, when Treasurer Wooden dropped out of the race when he did, but nothing against Eric. I think he's a great guy. Was done a fine job as vice chair, and I'm supporting Maritza, of course, because she's from New Haven. And
why do we need an elected state treasurer?
Well, the state treasurer does have responsibility for the state's investments. Although in many cases the treasurer hires and brings in investment advisors rather than making those decisions personally. But ultimately, the treasurer is the sole fiduciary and is accountable for those decisions. So I think it's good that you have an official separate from the governor who has that authority.
So you like the idea of electing a treasurer?
Yes.
All right. And what about nationally? The Democrats seem like a tough year this year with high inflation, low popularity of Joe Biden, gas prices going up. There's a little optimism now among Democrats because the gas price is coming down for now, and Donald Trump's candidates seem to be more extreme, so they might not appeal in governor and Senate races to the moderates who might swing the elections. But what do the Democrats need to be doing this year to make up for what looks like a tough hand?
Well, a couple of things. I think, first of all, the Democrats need to focus on asking every Republican candidate at every level, where do you stand on Trump? Do you absolutely forthrightly condemn his attempted destruction of democracy on January 6, 2021? Do you condemn that? Do you condemn everything he did between Election Day and that January 6th? And also, do you commit to be for somebody other than Donald Trump for president in your party? Are you willing to do something to save your party from what's happened to it? I think that's the key question for Democrats to ask. I think it's also important to look at social issues, at what the Republican history is about cutting services, and to remind people that it is.
All right, abortion, the Supreme Court abortion ruling, the Democrats are hoping are going to help them.
That's right. I mean, these are issues I think that
gun
Democrats need to bring to the fore.
Should Biden run again?
I don't know. I think he's got to decide that fairly soon. But remember, he turned out in 2020 to be the only Democrat who had the stature to beat Trump.
Right.
So I think that can't be discounted.
Well, is it different now? Because people are saying he's going to be so old by the time he'd be in office, and his ratings have gone so low. Although that could change.
That could change, and I'm hopeful that the bill now that he and Schumer and Manchin have come to an agreement on will.
That's
will be
all up
something.
to Sinema, right? So what's Sinema going to do?
It depends on. I haven't heard what she
hasn't said anything.
Said,
and
so
she didn't go to the caucus.
No, apparently
Democrats
not. So that's,
say, according to the Times, Democrats in the Senate find out what their colleague Sinema is thinking based on what she has told lobbyists who report back to them.
Yeah, I know it's kind of perverse, but
and it's also kind of interesting that she and Joe Manchin, two holdouts, actually disagree on a fundamental part of the bill. Like they incorporated in this reconciliation bill, they incorporated items that she wanted in the past to get her support.
Yes,
but she and Manchin fundamentally disagree about carried interest and sort of extra tax breaks for wealthy individuals and wealthy corporations.
Right.
He thinks they should start paying a little more, and she doesn't want to have any tax cuts. Will that kind of doom it, or we'll find out? Well,
we'll find out. I think there's a lot of pressure to get something done. And I hope they can find a way to compromise that and then hold all 50 Democrats together with the vice president to do the bill.
On a sports level, it was really fun to see Mitch McConnell for once have someone do an end round around him by having them pass the CHIPS bill and then 4 hours later announce this surprise deal.
Yeah, that was a delight.
The Wall Street Journal had 2 straight days of just like screaming in their editorials about that end run. Martin Looney, anything else you want to say about where politics is going now? Your run for re-election, this year's elections.
Just that I'm just looking forward to the campaign and to serving another term. I love serving in the General Assembly as much as I did when I was first elected. And when the first day I came to the Capitol in 1981 as a House member, I was just completely in awe of that Capitol dome and what it represented. And I still feel the same way every day when I approach that Capitol area exit. And I think when people lose that sense of wonder and pride in what they're doing, then it's time to consider doing something else. But it's still fresh to me every day.
All right. Well, Martin Looney, it's always such a pleasure to have you on WNHH-FM, Dateline, New Haven. Our first ever guest, and I hope you'll be back again.
I certainly will, Paul. Always enjoy it.
Thanks. And I want to thank Harry Droz and Nora Grace Flood working the controls today on WNHH-FM. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience, performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us all day and all night at WNHH New Haven's home for community radio.